I came across this wonderful quote from Buckminster Fuller, who said, "You never create change by fighting the existing reality. You have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And while I commend things like Extinction Rebellion and see the absolute crucial importance of things like civil disobedience now to rattle the cage and shake the status quo and get this sense of deep emergency across to these people, I think it's equally, if not more important, that the potential systems change role models in areas ranging from food and health and economics to community, culture and consciousness, which are the 6 topics we're tackling here and will be the sort of core topics behind the regeneration. So it's trying to kind of highlight what these potential solutions are, and what they all share, to my mind, is that they are not incremental optimizations of existing systems. They are actually step change systems. They're cyclical and not linear systems, and this is obviously where things like the principles behind the circular economy will come in. So I hope that gives you some kind of context of where this is all going. I'll be in here again tomorrow from 11 till 2, and again on Sunday, and also on Sunday afternoon with Russell Brand in the Park stage talking about consciousness. But I'm here now with my brother Hugo on my left, and Adam Lusby from Exeter University to talk about economics, or the circular economy and ecological design. Adam is helping set up a department at Exeter University, which is putting some of the great minds around these issues together in one university department, which I believe is the first in this country, if not maybe one of the first in the world. Some of you may be aware of Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, which brilliantly, lucidly explains many of these things. I'm not an economist myself. I really struggle with conventional economic terminology, but that book I was really able to digest and understand. Highly recommend that, and I'm sure there'll be other things that Adam might recommend too. My brother Hugo, who I've never done something like this with before, but I'm very happy to be doing so, and I'm sure he's far too modest to say so himself, but he really is an absolute pioneer, not just on sort of ecological design and technology. He's an automotive engineer. He's sort of background in storing classic cars, but also racing cars. He was famously a pioneering member of the Oxford Dangerous Sports Club many years ago. But has spent the last 10, 15 years working on this revolutionary car, which is just outside, which is the hydrogen fuel cell car, not a battery-driven electric car. We'll go more into that later. But I think Hugo's become as much recognized as a thought leader, a luminary in this area of the circular economy, as well as a design innovator. So I'm delighted to introduce them both here, and we will crack off with Adam. Could you just, to the best of your ability, summarize the core concepts of the circular economy?
Okay, so I'm on the spot.
Yeah.
Rory, thank you very much for having me. And pleasure to be here. I think the circular economy, so I'm going to start off a little bit more controversial, and will probably be controversial for the rest of it, knowing mine and Hugo's conversations over the last few months. I think that at the moment there's probably multiple circular economies. So the actual idea of a circular economy exists across the world in different entities. I think the most popular one at the moment is that it's a way of fixing what we would call end of pipe. So it's about recycling, it's about dealing with waste, and that's the dominant narrative about the circular economy. However, I think from a business perspective and from a theoretical perspective, it's a lot broader, and we see it as the full economy. So we see it as an economy that embraces all the externalities that the current economic, it's not just the economic theorists, but it's also the way we apply economics as we take these externalities, such as anything to do with global greenhouse gases or anything like that, and we don't count for them in our accounting system. So the circular economy tries to encapsulate all of those externalities, and then it's underpinned by, I think, some really simple, beautifully elegant principles. The first one is design out waste. So this actually takes us to the beginning of a business idea, when we first think about what we're going to make or produce, and we start to think about design as the first intent in the circular economy. The second one comes from Kate's book, and I think this has been a real beautiful addition. It's about redistributing resources. So in the natural system, we see the distribution of nutrients across the natural system. a cherry tree produces blossom, but that blossom doesn't just feed the cherry tree; it feeds the forest or the creatures around it. So it's not just feeding; it's not just a closed pipe system; it's an open system. And then a shift to renewables, and since the circular economy concept was really developed in its fullest sense by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation back in 2010, a shift to renewables has really become a possibility, a reality for a lot of businesses. There are businesses now stating that they are going fully renewable. So that shift is happening. How do we accelerate that? How do we use energy better? How do we maybe use fuel better is part of that question. And then the last one I think is a little bit more tricky. It's about creating, it's about building resilience through diversity. And this is about probably the last conversation you had about monocultures. So the classic one is that monocultures in agriculture and our agricultural systems are very brittle. If one disease comes along for a particular species, it can wipe the whole species out. So we spend a lot of energy and effort trying to keep a couple of species of plants going, whereas the circular economy would hope that we actually see the full range of possibly edible plants, I forget the number, but it's in the thousands, and use those more effectively. So, but you can take that into any sort of business that you think about, and there's a lot of research in resiliency theory that supports the circular economy. I hope that's covered some of it.
Thank you, Adam. I think that's absolutely brilliant. It actually, just going back to this last talk with Colin and Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, which I keep banging on about, but one thing that she highlighted in that book, the great failure of the conservation movement over the last century has been this fixation on a single species within its ecosystem that appears to be threatened, rather than looking at the wellness or the health of the ecosystem as a whole. And if we concentrate on the system as a whole, then all of the species within the system are elevated with it. And that's a sort of core principle behind the work that they're doing there. And I think that's an applicable and analogous thing to many of these things we're discussing here. So given that, and I want to then just ask Hugo how those principles have been integrated within the business model for Riversimple, but maybe before we launch into that, Hugo, could you quickly tell everybody here the basic, around the basic principles of the technology of the car, because it is completely revolutionary compared to anything that anybody's familiar with. And then we can expand on how the business model actually embraces what
I might actually just pick up from what Adam was saying, because to me circular economy is really just a matter of common sense, and I'm very resistant to methodologies that define what something is, because people then use that as a crutch and they stop thinking, and actually just being asked to think at a whole system level and work out your own interpretation of what the circular economy is, I think it's very useful, because people think better that way. Now, so there's lots of different perfectly valid interpretations of what the circular economy is. There's quite a lot of invalid ones too, and Adam referred to that. So there's an awful lot of circular economy light going on, being introduced in big mature businesses that start to recycle some of their product when they get it back from customers and things like that. It has got nothing to do with the circular economy whatever. And the circular economy affects every aspect of the business. It affects not just the product you make, the business model you employ, but the entire governance of the company. And so it's not something that can be very easily retrofitted to an existing mature business. And I wouldn't disagree with anything Adam said. We don't particularly use those as our rules. What we're trying to do is optimize the whole system of delivering sustainable transport. And the circular economy is a necessary but not sufficient component of achieving that end goal, which is all ambitious and a long way off. We are trying to optimize the whole system, and we believe you cannot do that by optimizing all the bits of the system. If you try and optimize the bits of a complex system, you pessimize the whole system. And so we look at all the different possibilities in everything we're doing, and we see what impact that has on the whole system delivery. And quite often we choose, for instance, in a car, a component that's heavier or more expensive or less efficient, because it gives a car that's lighter, cheaper, or more efficient. And that's very counterintuitive in the sort of reductionist culture that we've all been educated in. And so whole system thinking is terribly important. I think the two principles that we use to distinguish what we're doing from circular economy light is that the product has to stay on our balance sheet from when we have a clean sheet of paper designing it right through to end of life. And until that happens, you're not going to get the benefits of the circular economy, either for the business or for the environment or for society and the customers. And the second thing is all the operating costs through the life of the vehicle have to be internalized on the same P&L. And that profoundly affects the vehicle we build and so on and so forth. I think that's entirely complementary to Adam's definition of explanation of it. And so what Riversimple is all about is, and it's in our Articles of Association, the purpose of the company is to pursue systematically the elimination of the environmental impact of personal transport. And that's a big and ambitious goal. Elimination is a key word in there because I don't believe that reduction is a sufficient goal. Being less unsustainable is still not sustainable. So unless elimination is your goal, we're simply never going to get to the place we want to go. But it's not going to happen overnight, so the other key word in there is systematic. We've got to make sure that every step we take is leading us towards that end goal, rather than down some blind alley that's just a slightly less bad interpretation of what we do today. This involves changing the product, changing the business model, and changing the governance of the company. We think about three levels of design. Level of designing the product, the old sort of Bauhaus industrial design, level of design at level of systems, and so business models and things like that. And system level design is talked about much more in the last couple of decades, thankfully. And the third level is design at the level of ideology, sustainability, the frame of reference in which you're working, and the corporate governance. And we think all those three levels of design are critical. And it's critical that they all interact, and it's critical that we do all three at the same time. The only time you can do this, of course, is when you've got a startup company and a clean sheet of paper. There's very few advantages to being a startup, I can assure you. But the one big advantage is having a clean sheet of paper. And so at the level of the product, we are designing a car around hydrogen rather than trying to squeeze hydrogen technology into the sort of cars that have been optimized for 100 years around petrol engines. And we believe you need a completely different pattern of relationships in the car and make it in a different way, different materials, which means different manufacturing capacity, a different business model, different customer proposition. We never sell the car, we'll only ever sell the service contract. And all of those things the existing industry cannot do because it's got sunk investments of billions in production capacity spitting out steel cars. And if you try and incrementally put hydrogen into cars designed for petrol engines, you have to persuade the hydrogen to behave like petrol, which it really doesn't do very well. And so Toyota and Hyundai have spent billions. Toyota spent $8 billion to date. And it's a brilliant bit of engineering, but they're solving problems entirely of their own creation because they are trying to incrementally push hydrogen into conventional cars. The second thing is that we'll never sell a car. We only ever sell a performance contract, a service contract. Much like a mobile phone, typically customers will sign up for a 3-year contract, and it includes everything. It's not just the car and all the maintenance, but it includes insurance, it includes fuel, it includes road tax, things like that. And customers will pay a fixed monthly direct debit figure, plus a mileage rate, like a usage rate on a phone. When you fill up with hydrogen, you don't pay for the hydrogen, we do. It is the only transaction you have in having access to that car. And at the end of the 3-year contract, we offer you a lower fixed monthly price to keep it for another 3 years, or you give it back to us. And we provide the second, the third, a fourth-hand customer. The thing is, we never sell the car. And because of that, instead of obsolescence and high running costs, which are the drivers if you sell cars, our interests are longevity and low running costs, which not entirely coincidentally bring the opposed interests of customers and manufacturer completely in alignment. And for us, it's not a product we're selling, it's a revenue generating asset on our balance sheet, so the longer it generates revenue and the lower the costs of running it, and the more value we can recover at the end of life, the more profitable the car is, and therefore the cheaper it is for the customer. So it profoundly affects the design decisions we make at the beginning of building the car, because efficiency, for instance, is also in our interest. If you sell cars, there is no incentive to improve efficiency. Actually, we argue it's a disincentive, because it costs more to make a more efficient car, but customers will never pay more for a more efficient car. So it just reduces already pretty marginal profit margins in industry. So why are you going to pursue efficiency? The only thing left then is regulation, but because it's against your profit motive, manufacturers logically will only ever lobby against those regulations and then cheat when they come into force, as we've seen recently. So we believe that the biggest single change we need to see is actually not a change in technology to hydrogen or batteries or whatever. It's a change in business model so that to make efficiency profitable. And that's the best way of and we use that as a shorthand for sustainability. It's the best way, much better than regulation, of achieving sustainable transport. Basta.
Amazing. Thank you, Hugo. So, Adam, then coming back to the sort of meta-economic level, how do we get there from here, as it were? How do we take this fundamentally broken model that is built around quantitative growth models and the rest of it, and GDP, which actually just goes up every time there's an environmental disaster, and then all sorts of things which shouldn't actually be an indicator of our prosperity. How do we shift that to a more qualitative model without, this is, a massive question, of course, and I'm not expecting anyone to have the answer. But of course, it's in a way the most important one. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how we see this coming.
So I think I'm going to steal a bit of Kate Rayworth's thinking again, is that she says she's agnostic to growth. I think that's a wise thing to be in this day and age. We get sidetracked by GDP. The businesses I work with on circular economy, we're not looking at GDP. We're not interested in GDP. We're interested in growth. We're interested in growth for that organisation, and we're interested in growth towards a goal which is positive impact in what we do. And so what Hugo's explaining there is no doubt that if Riversimple grows and becomes the most successful car company in the world, that it will have a huge positive impact on what we do as a human species. So I think we've got to be careful about the ideas of what direction we're travelling in. And I think there's also another nice quote by William McDonough, who wrote Cradle to Cradle, which is one of the underpinning schools of thought for the circular economy. And he says, if you're heading towards Canada at 100 miles per hour, slowing down won't stop you getting there. And if you want to go to Mexico, slowing down to turn around might help, but you're still heading in the wrong direction. So a lot of the conversation at the moment in sustainability is about slowing down. And I think we have to slow down. That's not what I'm arguing here, but I think if we want to go to Mexico, we've got to think drastically differently. And for us, particularly from a business perspective, it's about talking to businesses about that this is business first, it's economics first, and there's a dividend for society and for the environment off the back end. And that can be argued through the model that Riversimple has built. It's the case study that we use with our students, in that we can see that there is a benefit to the way people engage with that company, how they work for that company, and there's also a benefit, obviously, for the environment off the back of it. I don't know if I've answered everything you asked, but there we go.
I think that's great. I'm sure there's maybe people here wanting to ask you, how would you recommend anybody who's interested in embracing these principles within their own lives, within the workplace, within their own company or a company they work in, what would be your sort of go-to advice on the sort of first steps to get down that track?
So the first resource is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website. They're a foundation that was set up by Ellen MacArthur, the world famous sailor, to transition to a circular economy, and they've spent the last almost 10 years building that case, building the economics, and building particularly the business rationale behind it. And they've just last week, they've launched an incredibly comprehensive education package that's open source, which a lot of universities, including ourselves, are using and will utilise over the coming years. So that's a great starting point. In terms of, I think a lot of people actually already engage in this thinking. I think this is also for organisations also are doing parts of this thinking. There is a mindset shift from this efficiency-driven drive, which Hugo's talking about. For me, I actually am trained as an architect, so I come from a design background, and one of the big moments for me that sort of shifted the way I think was listening to an architect business person from Amsterdam called Thomas Rauw, and he set up a circular economy business that tries to enable circularity in the Netherlands. And they built a building in the Netherlands that was just designed to be for 20 years. That was it. It was designed, its use period was defined by 20 years. And they did all the economics out, all the calculations out. What would that building cost once you disassembled it? How did you best build it if you wanted those components to still be valuable at the end? And one of the amazing counterintuitive things they came across was they were looking at wooden beams for the building, and by extending those wooden beams by 2 inches, the value of that wooden beam 20 years from now, it's predicted to be double what it would be without those 2 inches added. And so that's really counterintuitive to anyone who's an engineer, anyone who's a designer. We're always trying to thin everything down and peel it back because we're on this very short-term horizon. But take that longer-term horizon and we see the value of the assets, the cars, very differently, and then we've got the ability to wrap a different business model around it. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so Hugo, just coming back to the car, could you expand a bit more on the technology? You mentioned a bit about the hydrogen, but that's one of many aspects of the design of this car, which I'd love to throw everyone.
Yeah, so we are, our car is an electric car. It just doesn't have any batteries. It's got electric motors in the wheels, and we store the energy, instead of in batteries, we store it in hydrogen. We have no beef with battery electric cars. We absolutely believe that we need them. And they're just very different to hydrogen. And we need them for very different applications. After all, we don't have people asking, is it going to be wind turbines or solar PV that wins the renewable energy race? It's rather a silly question because they're just profoundly different and we need them both. And the same's true of batteries. And battery cars are very good for two things. One, they've got a very high powertrain efficiency. Most of the electricity that you put into the battery gets to the motor in the wheels. But I'm actually not interested in powertrain efficiency. I'm interested in vehicle efficiency. And the vehicle efficiency depends on its weight. And batteries are very heavy. So you can design a battery vehicle for very short range, and it's very efficient. But as you design for longer and longer range, the weight of the vehicle goes up exponentially, and the efficiency falls off a cliff. And so, crudely speaking, batteries are great for short-range applications, hydrogen for longer-range applications. But also, batteries are very good for stabilizing the grid with trickle charging at night. If you design a battery vehicle for longer range, you need fast charging on motorways, and the Tesla charger is 120 kilowatts. That tends to happen in the middle of the day. So you put a 120 kilowatt spike on the grid in the middle of the day. So you've got a heavy car. The battery in the Tesla weighs more than our car does outside. And you destabilize the grid. So there's really no gain from that. I have enormous respect for things like the Nissan Leaf and so on. But I think the Tesla model is a gross misapplication of a fundamentally good technology. Now, the only bet we've made in our car is we moved from a mechanical platform to an electric platform. We don't have drive shafts and things like gearboxes. We have electric cables. And that's about the only thing that the industry seems to agree on at the moment. We could take our hydrogen system out and put battery in or a diesel genset. It's got to be something that produces electricity. In a normal car, I mean, rather like the linear economy, we've got linear platforms in our cars. So you have an engine that drives through a gearbox to the wheels, and it provides all the power for cruising and acceleration. And when you brake, all the energy goes off as heat into the atmosphere. It's an entirely linear system. The engine has to be sized for that maximum acceleration, but in a normal car, when you're cruising on a motorway, you're only using about 15 to 20% of that peak power. And you only it's sized for the acceleration, but you're only accelerating for less than 10% of the life of the car. So the engine is 80% redundant for 90% of the life of the car. The same is true of the gearbox. And then the structure of the car is designed to hang on to these heavy bits in accidents. And so that's much heavier than it needs to be. And so you can see where that's all going. In our case, the fuel cell, and a fuel cell, by the way, is a fuel cell. The fuel cell converts the hydrogen into electricity. It doesn't store anything. The energy is stored in the hydrogen tank. It goes through a fuel cell, which is precisely the reverse of electrolysis. The old school experiment, you have a beaker, you put in water and electricity, and out comes hydrogen and oxygen. In this case, you put in hydrogen and oxygen, and you allow them to combine, but without burning. And the energy is given off as electricity. So out comes electricity and water. And so the only exhaust is water. It's about less than a shot glass of single spirit measure per kilometre dribbles onto the road, a mixture of that and steam coming out of the car. And that fuel cell is only sized for that 20%, the maximum constant cruise. And it provides electricity to all four wheels, and there are motors in all four wheels. They're visible in the car outside. And when you brake, they are the brakes. They become generators and generate electricity that feeds back into a bank of capacitors, or supercapacitors as they're known. These are genuinely new technology. And they store energy, but they're not a battery. The battery has a chemical process. A capacitor stores static electricity. So you can throw a lot of electricity in quickly. As we all know, batteries don't like charging fast. Capacitors do. We can throw 1,000 amps at our capacitors, and it's a little bank weighing 45 kilos. And they then provide 80% of the power when you accelerate. So the fuel cell only needs to provide the 20% that it's sized for the cruising. So our fuel cell is only that size. It's a standard production item made for forklift trucks, forklifts in Walmart warehouses in the States. It's only 8.5 kilowatts, which is less than the power of 3 domestic kettles, but it can keep the car running at 60 miles an hour. It can't go any faster, and it can't make the car accelerate very fast on its own. But we have another 50 kilowatts coming from the capacitors for when we accelerate. So we can do 0 to 60 in 9.5 seconds in that car, and it stops absolutely at 60 miles an hour and can cruise there. And that system is all fine and dandy as long as you can rely on the capacitors for 80% of the power when you accelerate. And the only way you can rely on them is to have very efficient regen braking. So regen braking's been around since the Toyota Prius. They talk about it. And when you press the brake pedal in the Prius, you have friction brakes and an electric motor on the front connected to the front wheels, which generates a little bit of electricity. The most you'll ever recover is about 10% of the kinetic energy of the car. In our case, we can recover over 50% of the kinetic energy of the car because all the wheels are doing electric braking, so we don't use any friction until we get to an emergency stop. And that compares with Toyota's. Toyota's car is a brilliant bit of engineering, but as I said, I really believe they're solving problems of their own creation. Their car is a great big limo. It's not directly comparable to our car, but it carries 5 people, not 2. It accelerates, though, in exactly the same time, 9.5 seconds, and it's got exactly the same range of 300 miles. But they've got a fuel cell that's over 13 times as powerful to achieve that, and they use over 3 times as much hydrogen per mile. And that cannot be explained just by carrying twice as many people. So all the components in our car are available off-the-shelf technology. We're not pushing the boundaries of the technology. We're not optimizing any of those subsystem components. The breakthrough is at the system level, the whole system design of the car. And when you're innovating at a system level, you can do it quickly and cheaply with small teams of people. And this is why we can do it, whereas Toyota can't. What they're doing is focusing on the subsystem level. Their only solution is through basic science, which is big budgets, big teams, and a lot of time. And so the advantage we have of the clean sheet of paper has enabled us to make that system level change in performance.
Brilliant. And I'm sure there are people with some questions coming up, but before we open up to that, just one or two more questions for each of you. But Hugo, I think following on for that, I'm sure a number of people here go, well, this all sounds too good to be true. How can I get my hands on one of these? How far off is it? I know you've had a couple of crowdfunding campaigns, and I really urge people to look at the Riversimple site and see what's there and get on board. But could you give us, and also just, is this scalable to a limo size, as it were, or to a four-seater car? So could we have a little bit, a little bit on all of that, so people can get an idea of how far off all of this is?
I think there's a few things. Not only are we, by being a startup company, it's clean sheet of paper, are we able to do things differently, but the company is designed to break even at a modest level of speculation compared with anything the auto industry is doing. And it's also designed to help create a transition. The one criticism we have of the auto industry is there is no transition strategy. There aren't hydrogen stations all over the country. And Toyota have built this brilliant car, and they're saying, well, we need 300 filling stations to create a market in the UK, but poor little us at Toyota, we can't afford that. And so governments, you've got to pay. And that isn't a transition strategy, it's just passing the buck. And I think it's generically true that all disruptive technologies all come to market in a niche, below the radar, in a niche where the weakness of the new technology doesn't matter. They never come to market in the mainstream segments. And the big weakness for fuel cell technology is hydrogen infrastructure. So we're targeting, this car is designed for the local vehicle segment. We don't mean urban, but people who want to operate within a 25-mile radius. And somewhere north of 3 million cars in the UK never go outside that area. 48% of families outside cities have 2 cars or more, and 1 car is generally a local car. And that means that if you put in 1 filling station in somewhere like Exeter, for instance, anybody who has a reason to come into Exeter at least once a week is a potential customer. And that's why we've got a 300-mile range. We want it to be at least a generous week's use of fuel, so that you only need to be coming into Exeter once a week, and you are a potential customer. And it concentrates the market so that it's easier for us to support all the cars in a small area initially, but also it's a much stronger business case for BOC or Shell or somebody to put in a filling station in Exeter. If we're going to put in 50 cars into Exeter, they've got 50 captive customers from day one. And it's a standalone investment that doesn't depend on 300 other filling stations around the country. And you can expand your market one at a time, one filling station at a time, but each one is a commercially viable investment. And so we are piloting 20 of these cars. This is we've been developing the technology for 18 years, but the first car we designed for, after 4 generations of car, the first one for use on public roads has been running for 3 years, the prototype of that. And this is the first of a limited production run of 20 vehicles that are going into a pilot in Monmouthshire with a filling station that's now operational in Abergavenny. And so if you're in Monmouthshire, you're a potential customer. If you're not, sadly, you're not yet. We hope to be in volume production by the end of 2021. And we think there are 17 filling stations in the UK at the moment, and there's a number of others committed to. Shell are falling over themselves, particularly to put in filling stations, despite the fact there's only 100 cars. But they are doing it, and there's enough filling stations in place or committed to support our first 3 years of production, even without the ongoing conversation that we have with BOC and Shell in particular, with 2-year warning to when we come to production. They will work with us to put in filling stations in concentrated markets to support our rollout. So we are absolutely not concerned about hydrogen filling stations. People talk about the chicken and egg. It's very clear to us the weakness is a lack of cars, not a lack of filling stations. But as Rory says, it is absolutely not restricted to this model. It is only a tactical entry point for us, for the company, for the refueling and the refueling infrastructure and the hydrogen. But the second car that we'll roll out 3 months or so after launching that in volume production will be a van for local delivery, using the same powertrain, made in the same plant and using the same local infrastructure strategy. And we will build a 5-seater car when the infrastructure justifies it. It is a bigger project, because if that car were doing 75 miles an hour on a motorway, which it could do, for 3 or 4 hours, you would find that the NVH is quite oppressive. It doesn't matter in a local car. Getting quietness at high speed is going to double the cost of the development of a 5-seater car, but that's where we will be going. And we will be working with communities as to where we roll out. We will be working with Shell to put in filling stations where there's most demand for our cars. So we want to be very proactive online and trying to use the power of public crowd wisdom to help us work out where we deploy.
Wonderful. Thank you. Adam, do you know about Charles Eisenstein's work as well? I'm not sure.
No, I don't. Elaborate, please.
Charles Eisenstein, I'm not sure if any of you here are aware of his work, but I highly recommend. He's an incredible thinker from the States, written a number of books, one of which is called Sacred Economics, where he really looks at how we can reframe our economics to make it more concerned with important things on every level. But two of the mechanisms he talks about that I'd be really interested in your thoughts on. One is this notion of a universal basic income, the notion that actually everybody gets a certain wage regardless of what they're doing, but also carbon tax as well, because I'd be really interested you expand on that. So there's a couple of things.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Right. So these are, I suppose, they sit on the edge of the circular economy. Maybe I can say it that way. But one of my other subjects that I work on and teach is the fourth industrial revolution, which is the coming together of. It's actually Schwab from World Economic Forum. So it's looking at the collision of all these technologies and how they change the context. From our point of view, how they change the context for how we do business. And there is no doubt that the level of automation sweeping across the business world is affecting how we employ and how we employ people. There's data coming out where large companies are automating what we would call white-collar workers who were doing, they've got degrees from universities that like the one I work at. They've probably got master's degrees, and their tasks are being automated. So it's no longer about robots replacing, factory workers. It is now very much about algorithms replacing what we would call as sort of like the high-level jobs. And so a lot of the big companies with acronyms that make up the consultancy world are facing this huge challenge of talent, sort of how they manage their talent. And one of the factors about that is there's a tension between, if you don't do the small jobs, how do you learn to do the big ones? So that's an interesting way of looking at it. And then what has risen, it goes back to the 60s, the universal basic income conversation about, what's the purpose of our economy? Should we just be extending the hours we work for productivity for this, for this weird world where we are just focusing on GDP output? So I think there's a really interesting conversation there. I know in the States there's a narrative around trickle-up economics, which I quite like the sound of, because we're obviously a lot of the economics we're currently sort of measured under as trickle-down economics, or the myth of trickle-down economics, and a universal basic income could definitely be that answer. There's a lot of challenges with that concept, in that we probably, we've still got, even with the conversations around universal basic income, we've still got this big question about what do we do, and what's purposeful and what's meaningful. And I probably, for all of us here, I don't feel like I work. So I'm very happy with what I do, and I'm lucky to receive a paycheck for it. But I do what I'm passionate about, and so I think that's the bigger question for me. It's the bigger question that I ask my students in my fourth industrial revolution module is what is it that you're passionate about and how do you get there, and does it support something?
This is regarded as one of the major factors of the sort of global depression epidemic is the lack of meaningful work. And Hari's book about depression, fantastic. It's one of the sort of 8 things he singles out there and totally reframes our understanding of depression. And I suppose people's argument about the universal basic income is people recall and go, well, everybody's just going to sort of lie around and do Eisenstein would argue that actually so many people are so consumed with the drudgery of whatever they're doing to just pay the bills and pay the rent and just stay afloat. Whereas if they had the universal basic income to fall back on, it would free up creativity and innovation in areas where it's currently deprived. And I think there's an enormous amount to that. In the same way that maybe scaling back to a 4-day week, horrors, but every day that everyone goes out to work, every day we're putting more carbon up in the air.
I think there's a point there, but I think in this conversation there is so much work to be done to create an economy that's regenerative and restorative.
Yeah.
So the work that we need to do, the people who are coming online from their education, who are coming into the workforce, the amount of effort and thinking and creation that needs to be done to make companies replicate what's happening at Riversimple is a mammoth task. And the science is saying that we've got a very short period of time to do it in. Yeah. So I think that universal basic income is, at the moment, I think it needs to be challenged in that there is actually a huge amount of companies that need to be started, scaled, that respond to the challenges that we're facing.
At the very top level, where are we at in terms of embracing these principles? Because there's something like the New Economics Foundation has been around for a long time now, and there'd be Paul Hawken's work in the States, the ecology of commerce, natural capitalism, and amazing books. The ecology of commerce was written in the early 90s, and many of these principles were there, pretty well fleshed out back then, but haven't really percolated through. Yeah. So, what's happening on that level?
So I think they're percolating through. So I think some of the thinking. I think there was a focus in the 20th century. We created the problem with mechanistic thinking, with reductive thinking. So we looked at the parts and we solved. But also, if you look at a lot of traditional sustainability, they had that same mindset and they applied it in reverse. So the circular economy wouldn't look at carbon as a negative. We're all made of carbon. There's a carbon cycle. So how do you engage with the carbon cycle, which goes back to regenerative agriculture? It goes with these big ways of looking at systems again, picking up on Hugo's point. So some of this, I think some of this is looking at it differently. It's using the contemporary scientific view of complexity to apply to this, and that context. I think some of those strands of that thinking that was done early on feeds into the circular economy, but I think there's some thinking that we need to challenge. It's about reducing harm is not going to slow us down enough.
It strikes me that we're still subsidising and rewarding and incentivising the most polluting industries, and the regenerative industries are the ones that should be subsidised and rewarded aren't. And it doesn't strike me that sort of shift on a meta level is really happening. That the polluters are still polluting more. And the struggling organic farmer is not getting the support that he needs.
And I think that supports my point as well, in that all of the lines, if we measure anything to do with the environment or society, they're all going in the wrong way. Yeah. All the trends, despite all the work by sustainability professionals for the last 30 years. Yeah. And so we have to. Einstein said something about you can't solve the problem that that created it, and I think that's a point about the circular economy. The circular economy is about business and economics, and the difference I think for me at the moment is seeing very large companies, some of the biggest companies in the world, engaging with us at Exeter to look at how does this affect their business. And I would also say that the circular economy, because of its design principles, we're not after policy at the moment. If we see policy, it's a design signal. It's a constraint that Toyota's example, put in the hydrogen government. No, Hugo's example is let's design a business that actually creates the solution. The whole business creates the solution. That's circular economy. And so I think there's so much more that could be done from traditional businesses, but also from startups. And those traditional businesses, to give you a flavour, we're talking about Unilever, Google, H&M. It goes on. These are massive companies, and they're very, very focused on the circular economy, on embedding it. They're big boats that need turning around, but they're on that journey, and some of it very quietly, without broadcasting to their consumers. They're getting on with it in the background, working out what it means for them, and I think that's an interesting space, because a lot of sustainability was what the term greenwashing has come out, and that these big companies were like, and we talked about circular light, and there is a degree of circular light. Coca-Cola in Brazil has launched a refillable bottle which has more plastic in it. Okay, I'm not claiming this is circular. I'll come on to that in a second, but I think the fact that they've gone on that journey from where they started about trying to just work with recycled PET, and now they've actually got refillable bottles, and they're working through that model of the circular economy, is testament to the power of the idea. Can I add two things? I think it's important. There's two things that I think that can distort the circular economy. It is based on natural systems. It's based on the living system, but the living system in our time frame is not regenerative or restorative. The White Cliffs of Dover were laid by animals, and that is a deposit. Oil itself is actually a pollutant from the biological system. And I think this is sometimes a little bit tricky in that there will always be leakage in the system. So this idea of the perfect system is very problematic for us. And that narrative flows into companies that go, I'm going to be circular by 2025. You're not going to be circular by 2025 because you don't sit within a circular economy. You can only be circular, and it probably won't happen in my lifetime. But the beautiful thing about that is that we're heading towards it, and the faster we move to these models, the faster we will mitigate the big global challenge that we have.
But just coming back to one of the original things you said about these so-called externalities being internalised, I think we often forget that the economic model we're still using was developed for the Industrial Revolution with very different parameters applying. We had sort of what appeared to be sort of infinite resource abundance, the notion of there being limitations to human ingenuity and growth and stuff hadn't even occurred to us. So we're still running the same sort of software economically as it was that was designed 200 years ago, 150 years ago, and which externalized all these social and environmental costs. So if a product actually internalized or reflected its real cost to society and the environment, it would no longer be economic for butter made in New Zealand to be sold at the supermarket down the road cheaper than the butter made on the farm down the road here. I think this country still imports almost exactly the same amount of butter that it exports. This is absolute insanity. And global shipping from trade, I think, is still like 4.85% of global emissions, which eclipses total aviation emissions, but doesn't get any commentaries or airtime because that's threatening the economic model. And all the emphasis through the mainstream is put on you, the consumer, for getting on airplanes and going on exotic holidays, which I'm not saying we should be doing, but I think we should also be looking at the fact that an enormous amount of unnecessary trade is going on. And then you factor in what the American economy has spent on keeping the price of gas cheap, if it was actually reflecting its real cost through its military operations globally, then the price of gas would be off the charts. So, but I don't see much of that necessarily happening yet. And how do you see that happening? Does that not need to be legislated? We're talking about massive structural changes to the economic system. And what I struggle with is seeing how we get to that from where we are.
So there's a couple of things. In complexity theory, a small iterance can have a dramatic effect. So it's not direct causality. So it's not Newtonian physics that we're working with in complex systems. So I think where the change comes from will be a surprise to almost everyone. So I think that's an interesting thing. It's not going to be us building a system, block by block in Meccano and then moving to it. It will evolve and it will emerge. And I think we're seeing the seeds of that within the thinking we're discussing today. I actually think there's some things about the circular economy and some of this new thinking that just says it's better business. So Hugo's proving that. It's going to take a while, but there are companies out there that are proving quite simply that actually reducing the overall load of what you're doing to the planet is actually beneficial to the company. And so and thinking it in systems means that you can capture that value. So at some point, the butter companies, the farming, the farmers or the manufacturing companies will go, actually, this isn't making great sense. There'll become a point where there's a different business model or an innovation that means actually that happens. I think an interesting factor there is that in the last 3 to 5 years, we've had a massive increase of flexitarianism. And so the dairy companies are now running scared because the products that they're replacing some of the intense agriculture, and that wouldn't be seen as circular economy necessarily, and it wouldn't be seen, but it was a trend within society that's driven a change, and it came out of maybe a blind spot for many. I'm going to be controversial, and I say this to my students as well. We should fly. We should keep flying. Should keep driving, but we should use the correct energy, and we should design the mode of transport to be renewable. And so there's incredible innovation right now going on in aviation. There's battery-powered jets being developed in France. There's which are small, that can, they're 5-people jets that will be autonomous. They'll be probably on the market within 5 years. There is a huge amount of work going into aviation fuel. I think we end up in that funny space of going, let's stop. And in nature, anything that is stagnant still rots. And I think if humans want to flourish on this planet, it's not about stopping, it's about changing direction.
Wise words. Before I open up, I'm sure I've got questions. Just so, yes, brilliant. Okay, well, one last question for Hugo. Yeah.
Can I pick up on some of the things that you've been carrying on from that? Because, it's been a very rich conversation. There's lots of different things to pick up on. Certainly, change the transition, how to do it, how to trigger it, and how to make it happen quick enough is really the burning issue. And we've talked about top-down and bottom-up and renaissance and revolution and so on, step changes. And I certainly I think it's a really good thing to work on Unilever to make them a little bit less bad, but I don't think we're going to get the level of change we need at the pace we need it by working with those corporations, and I don't think they'll ever end up in the same place as a business that's designed from scratch. And I think it was Schumpeter, the economist, who talked about capitalism as a creative destruction. And companies do come and go, and we've just got to grow up and accept the fact.
And faster and faster. So the turnover of companies now in this digital-driven age is increasingly faster, and so I think it is. I think this is something to. I think that particularly for people who are looking to start business, this is exciting. Yeah. You can get on. You can actually go and make something new that solves a problem, and it's a totally different mindset to the way that we built businesses in the 20th century. Sorry, you go.
No, absolutely. I'm completely with you. Where was I going? Sorry. So politicians, I'm afraid, aren't the answer either. The example, that by and large, politicians are followers. If you build a business that makes more money and employs people, they'll be immensely supportive. But they won't create the conditions when they're trying to protect jobs in Ford and so on. And so they can be a friend, but you've got to lead the way. And I think business is the quickest way of leading really fundamental change myself. But where was I did actually have a theme. But the example, for instance, you talked about the living wage. Universal wage. That is part of a complete revision of our tax system. And you simply cannot imagine the political classes embracing ripping up the tax system. We continue to tax labour, and we're more worried about employment than anything else. But it's still our principal source of tax. You tax what you're trying to prevent. That's why we tax tobacco. Why are we still taxing labour rather than taxing resource consumption? It's absolutely insane.
We've seen this in Sweden.
But you're not going to get that to change overnight. So you've got to get some level of change what you can by the Buckminster-Fuller line of building better models that makes the existing model obsolete.
We are seeing light in that, because Sweden has shifted a tax to, they've taken basically their VAT off anything that's repaired. So they shift, there's these amazing little things that countries are doing, particularly the Nordic countries, Netherlands and up, that these little shifts are really fascinating experiments in terms of how do we stop taxing renewables and start taxing finite resources, and that's a really key point.
Yes, but
everything's all back front and upside down at the moment.
Feels that way, yeah.
And they're really good examples, and they do give people more hope that we can change things fundamentally. But nonetheless, their income tax is still eye-watering compared to what we've got. So that system-level change is what we need to see, and I think it's just still a mile off.
Politicians always just add taxes; they never take them off.
No, absolutely. It's all incremental patching on top of patches and patches, and we need to end up taxing the greeds, not the needs. So it's not as if the tax burden on anybody is going to be higher. It is going to be different. It's going to be different proportions and from different sources. But the tax burden is probably going to end up pretty much the same. But it would end up taxing the things that we're genuinely trying to quell. And the Jevons principle, the efficiency argument that you're talking about making things better. Jevons was an economist in the 1860s who explained very clearly why, if we make the use of coal more efficient, we will not only get greater benefit from it, but we will increase the aggregated consumption of coal. And that is a very worrying thing. So, I mean, we are constantly asked, isn't our clean car an efficient car? One thing I didn't mention is our headline statistic is that the car does the equivalent of 250 miles per gallon in terms of energy consumption. But by doing that, we will increase the ability to drive unless we have some complementary measures.
Can I come in here, Hugo? Because I've got something here with the circular economy. I'm really fascinated by this. Throughput in a circular economy, when it's fully developed, is benign. Actually, it has a positive impact on the environment around it. So the consumption of stuff, if it is grown through regenerative agriculture and the nutrients are fed back into the system, is actually a positive thing. And so I think we can decouple from some of this, particularly what I would call mechanistic thinking about efficiency. Efficiency, if everything's designed, design out waste, right? Principle of circular economy, design out waste. If you start with that principle and where you end up, it doesn't matter how many shirts I wear. Actually, in the biological cycle of the circular economy, which we haven't really spoken about because we've got the car example here, but in the biological cycle, that's what nature's doing. Nature puts through millions, if not billions of tons of biological waste every year, and it puts it back into the system. And it feeds the system, it creates more.
And the problem is we create linear systems.
Yep.
It's not the consumption per se, it's
No.
what you're consuming and the rate at which
And I think that's part of the mindset shift, in that we're not trying to reduce the miles you drive. We're not trying to reduce the miles you fly. If it's designed correctly, it actually means that
what you're doing is regenerating topsoil
or the energy's so entropy plays its part. The physics comes in here, but the sun is beating down on us for hopefully another 2 billion years, and that is an incredible energy source, and that's how we get to build complexity in our system, is by harnessing that energy. And so if we can shift to renewables, another principle of the circular economy, then that allows us to do what we want to do.
Very, very quickly before I take some questions, Hugo, just very biohydrogen. One of the interesting things about hydrogen is that there are certain types of algae produce hydrogen as a byproduct of their photosynthetic cycle, which doesn't really happen in most biological mechanisms. But what I read a statistic the other day, it was something like if 1/10 of the land devoted to soya in the US was devoted to growing biohydrogen, it would meet the US's entire energy demands. I mean, that sounds pretty optimistic, but I'm just wondering, because at the moment producing hydrogen largely made from fossil fuels, we still haven't closed the loop. So to actually produce the hydrogen from a biological process, how far off that are we at the kind of scale that we need to develop it?
There's endless ways of producing, and we think of hydrogen as a common denominator rather than like electricity. It's not a fuel. Don't think of it as an alternative to petrol or diesel. And I'm quite sure that we will end up going back to our hydrogen grid being our gas grid being hydrogen. It was until the mid-60s about 60% hydrogen because it came from town gas, which came from coal. It was a very nasty cocktail, but it was about 60% hydrogen. And Leeds, in fact, has a project to convert its grid back to hydrogen by 2025. And for heating and cooking and boilers and so on and so forth, it's a fantastic energy vector because you can make it from any energy source, which you can't do with natural gas. And you can create it from biogas. All hydrocarbons, all living matter are largely made of hydrogen, and all sewage farms should be collecting hydrogen. And if you take the hydrogen out of the hydrocarbon, we argue that actually you can get much more economic utility from that. For instance, if you put than the alternatives. For instance, with cars, you could put your biogas into central generating plant and charge battery electric cars, or you could burn it in a combustion engine car, or you could take the hydrogen out and put it in our car. But you'll go far further per unit of biogas with that method than with the other two. But hydrogen can be made from algae, as Rory's pointing out. It can also be made through photocatalytic cracking of water. And that's a long word for basically using solar energy, concentrated solar energy, to create split water and create hydrogen, rather than using PV to create electricity to create hydrogen. It's a much more direct path, and it's got no moving parts. And once it's done at a lab scale, it's not done industrially yet. But because hydrogen can be made from any energy source, if we invest in hydrogen as one of our two key vectors alongside electricity, and they're much more powerful together than either one can be on their own, it means that we can invest in the infrastructure and all the vehicle technology, the boilers, you name it, and collaborate globally on those standards, and yet every region around the world can use whatever their local mix of renewables is. And those renewables are spread much more evenly around the planet than oil is. So it has huge consequences if we can get people away from natural gas and fossil fuels generally as our energy vectors. It will have geopolitical consequences.
And just lastly, am I right in thinking that China has taken a very high-level decision to go down the hydrogen route?
Yes.
Which is massive.
China, I mean, they do, for all their faults, they do have a much more scientifically literate elite than we seem to have. And they really have taken grasping the nettle in a big way. They recognize they cannot do it all with batteries. Even their main battery proponent a few months ago came out saying hydrogen is the way we've got to go. And all the auto manufacturers that we really respect, the Toyotas of this world, have been saying this for 25 years. It's just the media. It gets lost in the sort of the media sort of pendulum swings all over the place. But China, the one thing that is slightly concerning is that typically Chinese, they have got unbelievable ambitions in incredibly short time scales and are throwing eye-watering sums of money at it. So we're constantly getting inquiries from China. We actually signed a big licensing contract with a Chinese company for many millions last year, but not a penny arrived. And they are offering 200,000 renminbi per car from central government, and local government can match that with another 200,000. 400,000 renminbi is 45,000 pounds sterling per car that you make, and you've got to prove that you can make 50,000 of them a year. I mean, do the maths. I mean, you could give them away with cornflakes packets and you'd still make money. I mean, it is absolutely potty. But the consequence is that they're going to build massive, inefficient SUVs running on hydrogen. And so, although the intention is right, I'm very concerned about, and it will have a huge beneficial knock-on effect on reducing costs in the supply chain for a lot of the electrical technology and the hydrogen technology and fuel cells and so on. But it isn't going to end up with quite the outcome that they envisage.
A few minutes for questions before we break. This lady at the front here.
I was just interested in, just because my children are really anti-flying at the moment, and I just wondered why you said you should fly. Is it to be connected? Is it for sense of community?
I think it's, yeah, firstly, yeah.
The question was about flying and the fact that this lady's children were giving her a hard time about flying, and Adam was just picking up on Adam's point that we should keep flying, and just going a little bit further into that.
Yeah, so I think flying has made the world that we live in now. I think flying makes it possible. The connection of face-to-face meetings, face-to-face learning is critical. So I think we celebrate all those things. Maybe flying, you know, people can make their own choices. I'm certainly not saying if you don't want to fly, go fly, but I think there is an emphasis on maybe focusing on the wrong part of the problem. The wrong part of the problem here is the economic system, not the big, you know, companies that operate planes and the plane makers who are currently doing amazing work in the background trying to innovate for renewable fuels, because they all know that this is a huge risk to their business coming their way very quickly. So I guess for me it's about where do we put our effort. By not flying, I think the only people you hurt are the people employed by airlines. And I think that's just, you know, it's just one of those things. If we want to move forward with flying, we actually need to invest money in flying. One of the ways we do that is by flying.
Okay, yeah, thanks. It's a question that might get an answer from both of you, but initially it's about your business model, okay, and the risk that established manufacturers will obviously see how you're developing this. I mean, they'll be aware of it, and as your circular economy model grows, we'll look at that. But they are not circular economy companies, okay? Is there a risk for them actually using your technology, maybe, I don't know, remodifying a hybrid car, a Prius or something like that, for instance? It's already got its 4 electric motors, and then sort of back engineering it to you and effectively stifling your dream.
Well, we're not concerned. There are anti-competitive practices in the air, but we are pretty confident this is fundamentally more profitable than their model. We're actually going to open source all our technology when we come to volume production in a couple of years' time, and anybody will be able to adopt it, including the major OEMs. I don't think they will, because it doesn't really make sense to them. We're quite close to Toyota. They're very jealous of the fact that we're the only people in the world who've managed to package hydrogen into a small car, which they know they can't do. But there's no point in partnering with them. There's no point in them investing in us or copying us internally, because for us to be useful to them, we'd have to take on their constraints and their baggage, and we'd have to completely change what we're doing. And the next point, though, is our governance model, which I haven't talked about, but I did mention governance being critical. Our governance model has been designed, still to reward capital. We've got to get capital into this better auto industry. But B, to be more resilient than the short-termism of investor-driven companies. Dieselgate, Deepwater Horizon, Enron are all catastrophes for investors, and they're a direct consequence of excessive control in the hands of investors. supposedly working in their own interests, but with very liquid, tradable stock. So actually they're not interested in the company in 5 years' time, a lot of them, because they're going to be out by then. And that doesn't build a strong business. So what we're suggesting is a business where the investors don't control it. They have a voice, but they don't have control. It's great for investors who have a long view of investing in a company, want to invest in a company that's more profitable and more resilient in the long run, but it's no good for day traders. But the consequence of that is that if investors were to buy 100% of the stock in the company, they couldn't change the direction of the company, because we only have 6 voting shares. All the equity shares have no voting rights. There are 6 voting shares held by 6 companies, limited by guarantee, that represent 6 key benefit streams, the 6 critical stakeholders with whom we engage: the investors, the environment, the staff, the customers, the community, and the supply chain. And they all have equal voting rights. So if any of them, investors as an example, want to make some short-term cuts to improve their profits in the next couple of years, they've got to persuade 5 other or 4 other custodians to vote with them. So we are not concerned about a malicious takeover bid that destroys the purpose of the company or hijacks the purpose of the company, because actually the purpose is pretty hardwired into the business. We also don't feel that we are liable to be out-competed by them, because we have designed the business to do what we're doing. We've got a better business to deliver our product more profitably than they can. And actually, the reason we're open sourcing it is because the people who, our problem, our challenges, are not people copying us. Our biggest competitor is people who make diesel cars. And they're going to continue to be the bulk of the market for quite a while. And until an alternative model becomes a significant proportion of the market, prices will be set by VW and so on and so forth. And so we actually want to encourage people to copy us, because we want these standards to become widespread, ubiquitous. We want people to buy the sort of fuel cells we want, which are a 13th the size of the fuel cells Toyota want. We want all the repair facilities to embrace cars with our technology standards. If Sony lost their standards war on Betamax against JVC, then Riversimple will certainly lose a standards war against Toyota. So the best thing for us is as many people as possible copying us. Put the standards out there, the recipe for making money from making motor cars, and hopefully entrepreneurs will emerge who want to make money, because that's what entrepreneurs do. And I mean, it's going to be an interesting dynamic. I think the auto industry is in an incredibly difficult place.
One last question from this lady here.
I've been building in Berlin and been having investment from ethical bank GLS, which is similar to Triodos or the Umweltbank or these banks. And there seems to me a sort of opening in society, and this is what I tell students when they come around and build to move their money to ethical banks. Because if you get ethical banks involved in building projects and social projects, which then have ethical, sustainable businesses within them, which is what I've chosen to do, this all wouldn't have been possible in Britain. So there's only, I'm not sure how much people here are aware that if you can move your money, and young people are beginning to be seriously aware about it in Germany. I mean, the German movement of young people is extraordinary, and they all don't go to school on Friday anymore, which is fantastic. But anyway, I'm just wondering what sort of banking system shift needs to go on. Is it only literally people moving their money to these ethical banks? Is it happening in this country at all? Or how can one actually put one's money in a place that actually funds projects like your car, funds good buildings, funds agricultural, and these banks also invest in loads of organic farms. Triodos Bank is doing our organic farms down here in Cornwall. They're a Dutch bank. So these are cross-European banks. Some of them are. It's more to you, really.
Yeah,
How
okay.
it wraps up
Yeah.
ethical banking.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you. So capital is really important, as Hugo said. Capital is absolutely critical. I think the finance system, unfortunately, is geared towards the rich becoming richer, and banks being able to create money on one side of the ledger against debt is a huge problem for capital flow. If you look at the capital flow globally in the banks and you look at it against the likes of Triodos, they're just so small. They grow, yeah. That's totally agree. But the capital that we're talking about is our funds, which again, the invested funds that we have, apart from some of the big funds that we have are the retirement. The pension funds are massive. They have more sway in the market. But individual funds are almost now so small against the capital flows. And so the challenge for us is maybe a systems one more than I shift my money to a particular bank. I don't discourage it. I think Triodos in this country and across this region has done an amazing job and still is. They're doing an incredible work. And they've opened a current account. They've made some really great moves. But the problem with Riversimple is there's an abundance of capital out there. If you go to places like Silicon Valley and you go to London, capital is not short. There is actually, if you talk to the investor community, there's a difficulty to find what they call good ideas. And so the problems with capital are rooted in a system, a really challenging system for the financial system. And a lot of it has embedded risk over the next 10 years. So stranded assets, investment that's caught up in longer term incorrect investments, as maybe we would say, in the wrong industries, in the wrong business models. I think if I was young and I was investing, the crowd platforms and looking for organisations that are running crowdfunding is the best place to put your money. Not all your money. It's always wise to have more eggs in different baskets, but I think that's what we need to encourage from the younger business community, the young investors, is how do they source those great ideas. We're going to get a lot of traction through that is crowdfunding organisations. We're already seeing it in that these are funding startups that then are scaling. So I think that would be the lever that if we're looking for something to react to the capital flows, is how do I pull my capital and make the most of it? How does it do the most work for me? Not in terms of making the most profit, but how does it create the biggest benefit for all?
One thing I'd like to add actually also to that is that there's a real problem with capital, whatever shade of business you are, with pre-revenue investment. And particularly smaller funds, and these green funds are, in terms of, as you say, the scale, they're particularly concerned about risk. And there are very, very few funds indeed that invest in pre-revenue stage businesses. And, well,
Regular Commerzbank, Deutsche Bank are far more risk controlled than the independent co-op banks.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, they're actually more, they present millions and millions to a very risky project, whereas the other banks wouldn't touch it. So I actually don't think that the smaller banks are less risk.
right, well, yeah.
Perhaps you guys could carry on, because I'm afraid I've got to wrap up in here now to clear the room. We're running over time. But thank you all very, very much for coming. There's some leaflets about... Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you very much, Adam.